Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's session. My name is Michael Downey, and it's great to be back for another AWRI webinar. This is the fourth of 5 webinars designed to assist growers who are dealing with the effects of recent bushfires. And in today's session, we'll take a look at winter pruning and preparation. These sessions were formed as part of the Vineyard Mapping and Assessment project that was created in response to the Cuddly Creek and Kangaroo Island bushfires. The project has been led by Wine Grape Council of South Australia with support from Primary Industries and Regions SA, and was funded by the South Australian Wine Industry Development Scheme and approved by the Minister for Primary Industries and Regional Development, Tim Whetstone. The project has been supported by the following stakeholders: the AWRI, SARDI, Vine Health Australia, University of Adelaide, Adelaide Hills Wine Region, and Rural Directions. Before we jump in and make a start, a couple of quick reminders for anyone new to webinars. To ask a question, please open the Q&A part of your webinar toolbar, type it in and click to send it through. We'll be running a dedicated Q&A at the end of the session, but please feel free to send through any questions you have at any stage. Just a reminder, the webinar is also being recorded and it will be available to view via the AWRI's YouTube channel. For anyone that's just joined, welcome. Today's session takes a look at all aspects of pruning after a fire event, and it's great to have Dr. Richard Hamilton from Hamilton Viticulture with us today, who will explore these factors in detail. Richard has more than 40 years experience in viticulture and spent 12 years with the Department of Agriculture. Richard also spent 12 years working as a national viticulturist with what is now Treasury Wine Estates before establishing Hamilton Viticulture back in 2010. We're also fortunate to have with us Colin Hinsey, who many of you would have heard from our first webinar in this series. Colin will be contributing some content throughout or at some point in the presentation, and will also be available during the Q&A. So welcome to you, Colin, also. Richard, thank you for joining us today. It's fantastic to have your expertise on hand. And with that, I'll hand over to you to make a start.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, I'm talking today, reinforcing what's been said previously. This is in relation to the Cuddly Creek bushfire in the Adelaide Hills, which occurred on Friday, December the 20th. I'm going to begin by discussing vineyard variability. This obviously has a major impact on quality and quantity within the vineyard, and I'm looking at what the relationship is to profitability and the ability to manage better in the future. So looking at this, I'm thinking about a single block in this discussion in terms of variability, and thinking about a single rootstock type and one clone. The items that have just popped up in the dot points there are the variables that are occurring. So what we're looking at is the impact of soil type and depth, the elevation of the vineyard. Wire fill is an important factor, as are trunk disease levels, in terms of achieving profitability. What's the optimal status then for vineyard profitability? Clearly, it's a situation that we're looking at in terms of how much wire fill there is. Ideally, it's 100%, but the reality of grape growing is that that's difficult to achieve. Gold standard would probably be 95% fill, dropping down through to 85%. And at that sort of point, you're starting to have a serious impact on the potential production from that vineyard. What we're also looking for is an homogeneous population within that vineyard, ideally, or block. Ideally, all of the vines are the same age, and ideally all of the same vine vigour. Of course, in the Adelaide Hills, that's more difficult because of slope factors, for example, but that can be a major issue. We're also looking at minimal trunk disease issues because that's an emerging problem across the region. So what we're looking to achieve is an evening ripening capacity across the block, and that's allowing us then to meet contract and wine specifications. So what's the impact of fire damage? Now that's very dependent on a number of factors, the intensity of the fire, the duration of the fire, and the amount of flammable material that's within the inter-rows and undervine material, and also, of course, the row's proximity to outside vegetation that can have a major impact on the vineyard. This is a stylized diagram of a vine, and what I've done is just overlay a very rough indication of what's happening in terms of heat. The fire is obviously coming from down low in terms of material that's burning, unless of course you've got side winds that are occurring. And the expectation is that most damage is likely down low in the vine and moving up into the upper areas. Of course, in terms of understanding what's happening with the vine, we tend to look at the buds up in the top. But what we need to be aware, of course, is that if there's been any impact down through the cordon and indeed down to the trunk, then issues are going to arise. Just to give you an example, this is a shot of a vineyard 2 days after the fire. What you can see here is there's been a fire move through the interrow area. There doesn't appear to be much damage underneath in this particular example under vine. And you can see in terms of the heat effects from side to side, the wind was in fact blowing across the vineyard. You can see that there's more damage on the windward side than on the leeward side of the vineyard. What that's meant then in terms of damage to the vines, here's a panel of 3 vines. This vine here at the furthest out has actually managed to shoot again, but has actually ended up collapsing, and that relates to the damage that's occurred down low in the vineyard, in the vine. The middle vine here has not in fact shot at all, and the vine right to on the right hand side has shot vigorously from the root system. I'm taking an example from material that was presented by Cass Collins from work from Roberta DeBay and Lucas DeSimino. And just using that example, I've put a table together. In that example, we had 65% of the vineyard with minor to moderate damage, 9% with severe damage, 20% with no visual signs of damage. In an ideal situation, we're getting 100% production. I'm not suggesting that's achievable in all vineyards, but hopefully we're at least getting to 90%. Let's look at what's happened in this particular example in terms of post-fire potential. In undamaged vines, we've got 26% with 0.9 of the original production. Minor to moderate, we're probably ending up somewhere between 40 and 80% production. And of course, the dead vines, we've got 9%. What that comes up with is a figure that is 64.5%. And what I need to just point out for people with this particular presentation, the Adelaide Hills region currently has a 50-50 end use for either own winery or contracted fruit. So approximately half of the region produces fruit for contract. The recommendations that I'm presenting are targeting best viticultural practice to meet contract specifications. For own wineries, there is the potential to manage small batches of wine, so they may be able to profitably manage greater vineyard variability. But what I'm aiming at here is to get best practice within the vineyards. So clearly at 64.5% of the post-fire potential as compared to the original 90% is not acceptable. We've got to deal with that. This schematic, I'll develop this slowly as I work through with you, is a 30-year production estimate and does some comparisons. Now, please note that this is a hypothetical and does not account for missing vines, which could potentially be filled in by layering through a 3 to 5 year program once vineyards are established. So in a no-fire situation through here, I'm saying that production is at level 1. But bearing in mind, of course, looking at 2019, obviously none of the vineyards were affected, but unfortunately, of course, we had a very bad season and only 58% of production. Unfortunately, 2020, we were also looking at a similar production, but of course the fires come in and changed the picture quite dramatically. So looking at scenarios, the first is cut back in year 1. And in this instance, I'm suggesting, of course, that there's no crop because it got burnt for the 2020 vintage. Those people who've cut back in year 1 and trained up are likely potentially to get up to 25% fruit production in year 1, 2021. About 80% in year 2, 2022, and then into full production. For those who've held back and cutting back at year 2, of course, there'll be no production because we'll be cutting back this winter. So there'll be no production of fruit for 2021. However, based on managing or reworking vines and given the root systems that are involved, the expectation is that we may end up with 0.5, 50% production in 2022 and back to full production by 2023. If things are very, very badly damaged, then a replant situation comes in. And what I'm proposing with this, of course, is you've lost your production in 2020. In 2021, it's not possible to plant, and I will be reinforcing some of the material that Nick Dyer mentioned in his seminar last week. And so what you'd be looking at is to be planting in 2022. And based on experience in establishing vineyards, we're looking at perhaps 20% production in year 2 of post-planting, 50% in year 3, 80% in year 4, and full production in year 5. So what does this mean over a 30-year term? What we're looking at is obviously 30 years worth of production where there's no fire, but it's actually quite a small amount that's lost in a cutback situation. In a replant, however, we've lost 5 years production, but bearing in mind that we're going to have to rebuild these vineyards, this simply requires a 20% increase in block performance to break even over those 25 years to catch up those 5 years of lost production. So assessing a damaged vineyard, we're all looking very strongly at how much damage has occurred, as I mentioned here. Clearly the buds are the most important factor in terms of fruit production, but it's also about the damage that's occurred down back near the trunk. But in a severe fire situation, we need to bear in mind that there's a root system below, and viticulturists tend to forget about this root system. This is actually critical to the survival of the vine. And Greg Horner's data from the fires earlier is showing that just how strong vines are. And we start to hear discussions along the lines of just that vines are weeds. December the 20th was, with the loss of income to a third of the vineyards in the region, was absolutely shocking for growers. I've had many discussions with affected grape growers and winemakers, and I've been grateful for that opportunity. I'm very impressed with the calculated assessment that affected owners have had. And if this seminar achieves one thing, it's that to get you to think about your vineyard and look at the best options for the future. Hopefully by now, the pain is to the point that you can accept that there's an opportunity to improve the vineyard for the future. So coming back to optimal status, clearly we're needing to look at maximising wire fill. We're also looking at trying to minimise the age differences in the vineyard. Obviously, there's the desire, depending on the number of vines that are affected, to leave vines that are in full production, leave them alone and hope that they go well. But if they've been damaged, there's a major issue. We're also looking at vine vigour. The other aspect too, which has come up in a lot of situations, is vineyards may well have been suffering from trunk disease issues at fairly low levels, and this provides an opportunity to do something about the future. Because at the end of the day, what we're looking to achieve is an even ripening capacity across the block, and that we're able to meet the contract or the wine specifications for the vineyard. Moving on to look at regrowth observations, and I'll start off with a situation of no intervention. What I'm seeing across most vineyards that are damaged, and I haven't looked at all, but I looked at a large number, mild truck damage has good cordon growth with some suckers. Moderately fire damaged trunks have mainly sucker growth. And here's an example here where there's very strong growth in this vine that has been largely unaffected by the fire. In this instance, where there's damage either to the cordon or the trunk, quite a strong sucker development and very poor growth in the third vine along through here. The misses also require consideration, and I will keep reinforcing this. One needs to decide what level you're prepared to accept of wire fill, whether it be 95, 90 or 85%, and work from that point. I'd now like to hand to Colin Hinsey from Rural Directions, because he's just come in some fresh data. We did some bud dissections on Chardonnay and Shiraz, and he has some new data on bud viability in a fire damaged Chardonnay vineyard. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Richard. So as an extension from the South Australian Wine Industry Development Scheme mapping and assessment project, we've been able to extend that to undertake some bud dissections on targeted patches of 4 key varieties. So we've done the key varieties being Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay and Shiraz from fire damaged vineyards in the hills. We've targeted cuttings from those, from the 3 damage levels of nil, minor and moderate, which I'll review in just a second. And we've sampled both canes and spurs for evaluation. As a quick reminder of the allocating scores from the webinar a couple of weeks ago, a minor affected vine, we're looking at the characteristics being the evidence of damaged leaves, mainly basil. We're looking at majority of grapes being sound, and that the rachis or the bunch stem still being green. So minimal damage, but certainly evidence of heat and fire damage. Looking at the moderate damage level, we're looking at major bunch zone damage where the grapes have been desiccated, any retained leaves and or new growth above the cordon does exist, and on an initial assessment these may have been considered severe initially. So the sampling method, we started with selecting blocks that had a range of damage of nil, mild and moderate. We then identified adjacent zones of the same score, and what we're looking for here is trying to not skew data between, say, the tops and the bottoms of the hill where you might expect different vigour and yield potential. We've tried to find patches that are relatively close to each other to minimise other variability factors. Then within that geolocated 5 vines, so we've got a point we can go back to for each of those cuttings. And then sampled what we'd call replacement canes. So if that block was to be cane pruned, here's some example canes and what they would look like. And then we've sampled spurs from along the cordons as well. So some data here. Today we're just looking at Chardonnay as an example. It's still very much a work in progress. So here we're comparing nil damage to minor damage. So primary buds are the dark blue, which this is purely is the bud alive. So we're primary and secondary buds being viable and pretty consistent between what you would expect to be nil damage and minor damage. Nil damage was about observed symptoms rather, but that doesn't actually account for the fact that they still would have undergone quite severe stress. So nil and minor were quite similar, whereas when we look at moderate damage, we can certainly see a decline in the percentage of viable buds in positions 1, 2, 3, and 4, if this vine was to be spur pruned. We go to canes, there's buds 1, 2, 3, and 4, it's the same data. We're now adding on buds 5 through to 10. And nil compared to minor, we're certainly seeing some decline in bud positions 5, 6, and 7 as well. So possibly not directly damaged by fire and heat, but certainly impacted in a developmental sense. The picture when we look at moderate damage is much more severe as well. And interestingly, the further along the cane, the less viable buds there are. So again, probably an impact on the physiology of the plant as much as anything. So we look at that in a fruitfulness sense. So this is just taking all of those buds 1, 2, 3, and 4 for nil versus mild versus moderate. And so that shows our alive buds. And in the yellow, we're looking at the average bunches per node. So the numbers are pretty similar. And if we were to look at the moderate vines with, if we were just to do a 2-bud spur, for example, on the assumption that we got 14 2-bud spurs from these vines at an average of 2.2 bunches per shoot, that vine in theory has on average 31 bunches produced from a 2-bud spur. I might just go back one click, Richard, if we can. The other point I'd like to make here is that there's not a huge gain in buds 3 and 4 in the moderately affected Chardonnay. So if you were contemplating pruning to longer spurs, you would assume that only 2 of those buds would burst. So there's no more fruit in buds 3 and 4 than there is in buds 1 and 2 in this example. Thanks, Richard. When we look at the canes, it's a much more extreme story. Obviously, the average shoots per node, or the viability, is much worse in moderate, and that's also reflected in the average bunches per node. So to cane prune in this example, if we just went for 2 canes, that should read 2 10-bud canes, The average on those is only around 11 bunches. So we're only going to generate 21 bunches per vine in that sense. So in this example, if you were looking at trying to optimize a crop response, you may well be better off with the spur pruned and no clear advantage out of doing to canes. So in summary, to this point, we've only got one of the 4 examples being Chardonnay, and we're looking at having the full data set available within the next 2 weeks to fully inform across all 4 varieties. Nil and minor are very similar viability and fruitfulness. The moderate damage, we see significant decline in all buds. 4 bud spurs may not be required, particularly if you're looking for a yield response. And cane pruning is not likely to be the answer, particularly for the moderately affected vines. So, as I said, more to come when we get the full data set. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks very much, Colin. Excellent, giving further insight into the suggestions we're making in this presentation. So in terms of managing no intervention vineyards, bearing in mind that I'm talking about contracted fruit and trying to minimise variability in the vineyard, we need to be thinking about pruning to the vigour of most of the vineyard. If you think about the situation in terms of how you would manage irrigation, for example, you're not going to be irrigating for the most vigorous vines in the vineyard. Also, you're not really going to be focusing and targeting the least vigorous vines in the vineyard. What you're looking to do is to try and target your middle vigour so that you can minimise the variability across the vineyard. So what I'd suggest then is that if you've got significant damage, then there needs to be a situation of beheading all the vines, taking care not to damage regrowth. The idea being to use what carbohydrates have been stored back into the root system to give you an optimal chance to get a vine structure established. In this instance, choose the best sucker and train that to the wire. Again, I'll just reinforce the fact you're choosing for yourself what is acceptable in terms of vine fill. I'm also going to suggest, given that we seem to be getting such high variability in climatic conditions, that you should consider heading back to 5 buds in case of frost to ensure even growth across the vineyard. This is an old trick I learned in the Coonawarra region. Basically what that's doing, when you're pruning back to 5 buds, the top dominant buds will come away. If they happen to get frosted, you get a second go 2 to 3 weeks later. If other buds will come away, fresh buds, which is what you're looking for. If by chance there's a 3rd frost, then you've got a period of 6 weeks, and it gives you a chance not to be in strife during the season. Now turning to regrowth observations for beheaded and pruned vines. We're again seeing growth in most vines, but one thing I've noticed is that we'll need to watch the percentage of vines that show no activity. Now, this can be quite common in a reworking situation in that the shock of beheading the vines, and of course normally that shock of beheading is occurring early in the season rather than midway through, December the 20th from the fire. But it does concern me that the percentage of vines that are showing up that are not growing, and I'm wondering if that's an indication of trunk disease issues or perhaps others. But bearing in mind, it's an incredible shock. This was post-conditional dormancy, a very difficult situation for a vine that's been treated in a way it's not used to at all. I'm noticing that there's generally weak growth where suckers were headed, and I guess that's not surprising. So basically you've chosen the best shoot to move up, to get up to the wire and sitting with it, but growth is fairly weak. Contrasting that, and admittedly in this particular vineyard, there's been copious use of manures to help the vineyard, but in this instance, very pleased to see that there are multiple canes and the level of growth, whilst not being as much as perhaps a fully developed vineyard, is significant. And they are going to be pumping back nutrients into the, and carbohydrates into the vine, ready for it to come away in the following season. So in terms of managing beheaded and pruned vineyards, what I'm suggesting is that you should be pruning to the vigour of most of the vineyard. Again, that concept of pruning to the middle third of the vineyard, or if you like, the in quarters, perhaps the 2nd or 3rd quarter, but trying to get something that's in the mid-range. For beheaded vines, fully mature buds, cut 3 nodes below the last lignified wood on the growth. This shot was taken last week. You can see that lignification is starting to happen here, and we've basically not got lignification up at this point here. But what you can see counting back, 1, 2, 3, where lignification has started, this bud is starting to show the appearance of full maturity, and it's going to give you the best chance of giving a good solid shoot growth for the future. Again, consider the 5 budding for all growth, where mature cones to the wires are less than 70%. Rehabilitate or replant. If your vineyard is very badly damaged, now is the time to be reviewing the vineyard's earning capacity. I was very impressed with a number of growers who sort of said, look, you know, this variety hasn't been returning much for me. Maybe this is a sign for me to get on and change varieties. So think hard about that opportunity. And certainly in a vineyard like this one, where there's quite a deal of difference in terms of the response, really a replant situation is the best approach. The other aspect too is an opportunity to deal with variety in clones and to perhaps look at what might be best for your vineyard, but equally too, it might be a chance to get rid of trunk disease issues, which are an increasing problem in Adelaide Hills vineyards, and a fresh start may help and work from there. Don't forget, we're building a vineyard for the next 30 years. You saw that data in an earlier slide showing that you're only losing 5 years out of the next 30, and the challenge to get your vineyard up and performing as best as possible. And of course, apply best practice. And I'll a little bit more about that when I talk about planting material and material that was discussed from Nick Dry. So back to our diagram of a vine, bearing in mind that you're dealing with above and below ground. I'm also showing a diagram of a rootling going in, and let's put that into proper perspective in terms of the size. What I want to point out here is that the existing root system, assuming you've lost that whole top, that existing root system has a large readily available water supply, whereas a rootling has a very small area, and the management needs to be much more precise for success. It is my view that if you can make use of that existing root system, that's well worthwhile. But as we've said, if everything is adding up that you need to start again, then let's get into that. So in replanting fire damaged vineyards, and just picked out a couple of recommendations from Nick Dry, please plant 1-year-old rootlings. I have dealt with a number of court cases, expert witness situations where people have tried callus cuttings against 1-year-old rootlings. If everything goes perfectly, you can get an outcome from callus cuttings. But my goodness me, it's a disaster if things are difficult. And certainly our climatic situation at the moment, the extremes that we're seeing, I really would be recommending planting 1-year-old rootings. There's another benefit to that too. It's going to allow you 1 year's fallow, because you're not really going to be able to get the exact material that you want for planting for this coming season. You're going to need to order that material now, ready for planting in 2021. So remove all the roots this winter, and of course soils are nice and wet to try and get that out. Hopefully it doesn't bog you, but need to work from there. It gives you an opportunity with that fallow situation to also remove any regrowth that occurs in the following autumn, winter, to make sure that the vineyard is clean. I'd also recommend considering cover crops to maintain soil biota, keep that soil alive rather than just dead. Nick also mentioned soil preparation. In establishing rootlings in where existing vines have been, there's a whole biota there that can be quite aggressive and against rootlings, but the use of compost and manures freshens up that soil and gives the best chance for those rootlings to take off in time. Another factor is optimal planting time. We are seeing extremes in weather, and so in this situation we can look to be minimising frost risks, perhaps planting in late September, but equally reducing risk of heatwave activities. And if you can be in by the end of November, and ideally in early November, it can make a huge difference in the long term to the vineyard. So just to summarise then, the fires were horrific and have caused a lot of damage. I think people have had a chance to think about where they are, and there is an opportunity to review the vineyard's earning capacity, an opportunity to review the variety and clones, and to look at trunk disease issues. Essentially, we are building for the next 30 years, and that needs to be well borne in mind. And please apply best practice to achieve maximum profitability for the vineyard. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you, Michael, and throw it open to questions.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much to Richard and to Colin for presenting this topic. Both Richard and Colin are going to stick around for a little while to answer any questions that you've got. So please, if you do have any questions, this is your opportunity. Start to send them through. Quick reminder, if you're not familiar with Zoom, to ask a question, just open the Q&A button on your toolbar, type your question in and click to send it through. While we're waiting to see if we get any questions, Richard, I might just remind the audience that you will be presenting next week's webinar also. I believe the session will be around training fire damage vines and replants. That'll be on the 21st of May, Thursday, same time as usual. Did you have any insights around what that presentation is going to look like, Richard?
Yes, I'm just looking at the factors that are facing us, and what I'm looking to do is to go through detail of each of the different approaches that might be used, and just some tips and tricks that picked up over the years in terms of managing to optimise that growth during the season, and to ensure that you've got optimal material that's going to produce a crop in the following year. Are pretty critical steps. The other aspect too, we put out recommendations with regard to managing disease in vineyards that have been fire damaged, and I'm noticing that there's a lot of powdery mildew, a lot of downy mildew, and I'm noticing also there's a fair bit of vine moth damage at the moment. So just some reminders in terms of the extra care that's required in a fire damaged vineyard for disease management in the coming season.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that little sneak peek to what you can expect if you join next week. If you haven't registered for that session, then just visit the AWRI website to do so. Colin, Richard, doesn't look like we're going to get any questions or comments. No, hold the phone. So we have got one come through. As you'll notice, both Colin and Richard's contact details are up visible to you now, so I think they're both happy to be contacted directly. So we have got a question here around someone hasn't quite understood the 5 buds when retraining the vine. Is that to keep the 5 buds over the main wire?
Okay, what I'm referring to in this situation is where things are very uneven in the vineyard. I'm actually suggesting cutting right back down to the base of where the new shoots have come away, the suckers have come away from the base. If you remember, I was suggesting that you behead the whole vineyard, and the 5 buds are just to provide that optimum chance to get things away. The reason I'm suggesting cutting back that hard is if you haven't got 80 to 90% of canes actually reaching and tieable to the wire, then you're probably better off to actually come back down to the base of the vine. The vigour and growth will give you low internode numbers and will give you a trunk that's going to give you less problems in the future.
Okay. Thanks for your question there, and thanks, Richard, for providing some comments around that one. I think we might wrap up, Richard and Colin, unless you've got any final comments you want to make.
Right, thank you. Colin, have you got any comments?
No, just thanks for the opportunity to present the preliminary data within your webinar, and yeah, we'll come up with a method of delivery for the full data set once we've got it all collaborated and understood.
Look forward to it.
Okay, so we do actually have another question that's come through, and it's around whether you would recommend paint on top of large cuts.
Ooh, Thank you. I've been reminded, yes, if you look very closely at some of the shots I've shown in the presentation, yes, there's paint there all the time. At any stage, paint must be used. Talking with Mark Sosnowski, I mean, obviously a situation where perhaps you might use fungicide within paint, but the most important thing is to actually get that cut covered up and protected as quickly as possible after making those cuts. But you probably would have noticed in some of the pictures that I showed through the presentation, there was very clearly paint that's gone on very, very quickly. And based on data from Mark Sosnowski, if you can get that on the same day, it's going to minimise the risk of potential infections in that process. And when we talk about cuts, basically, if you can achieve it, anything above 1 centimetre should be considered painting, or perhaps consider using sprays recycling sprays if possible, to provide protection for the vine. To have had gone back to square one and to then get caught by trunk disease would be disastrous.
Okay, thanks, Richard. We've also got a follow-up from that first question, asking whether you would suggest to go back to buds for any vine not reaching the wire and have 5 buds for the one reaching the wire. Does that make sense to you, Richard?
Okay, so I'd go back to buds for any vine not reaching the wire and have 5 buds for the ones reaching the yeah, look, what I'm suggesting is that if you haven't got more than 80% that have reached the wire, then take everything back to 5 buds. I think that answers what you're talking. Oh, 2 buds. No, look, look, if the wood is mature up for the 5 buds, I wouldn't go back to 2 buds in case there's a frost. Or, for example, that you've got insect or beetle damage. 5 buds, provided you've got the old rule for pruning, which is that you've got pencil thickness and that you've got full lignification. I'd be looking at the 5 buds to give you an extra opportunity if there is some frost issues and or insect or other damage.
Okay, thanks again. And just to be clear, that was about going back to 2 buds. Okay, I think we might wrap it up there, Richard and Colin. I'd like to extend a really big thank you for coming in and providing some valuable insights to the audience around this topic. And thank you also to the audience who's logged in and participated. All attendees will receive a link to the recording of this webinar. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is the second to last session for this series of webinars. The next one will be on the 21st of May. Richard again will be joining to discuss training fire damage vines and replants. That's all we have for today. Thank you again to Richard and Colin, and I look forward to seeing you at the next AWRO webinar.